Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June 1941, was Germany's massive military invasion of the Soviet Union. As the largest military operation in history, it involved over 3 million Axis soldiers and aimed to conquer vast territories in the Soviet Union. The German doctrine of Lebensraum, or living space, argued that Germany needed additional territory to sustain its growing population. The fertile lands of Ukraine, the vast plains of Russia, and the industrial resources of the Soviet Union were seen as essential to German self-sufficiency and long-term economic security. The German planners sought to annihilate the Soviet military within weeks, expecting a rapid collapse of the Soviet resistance. Blitzkrieg tactics were to be used to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in a swift campaign. The final military goal of Operation Barbarossa was to reach and secure the so-called Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line, stretching from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Caspian Sea in the south. This would have effectively cut off the remaining Soviet territories east of this line and ensured German dominance over the European portion of the Soviet Union. The plan assumed that the Soviet Union would collapse if deprived of its most vital economic and industrial centers west of this line. However, beyond its immediate military objectives, Operation Barbarossa was deeply intertwined with Germany's ideological ambitions, particularly the Generalplan Ost, or General Plan East. This master plan outlined a vision for the complete restructuring of Eastern Europe through large-scale ethnic cleansing, genocide, and Germanization. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler sought the rapid destruction of the Soviet Union. However, the invasion failed to achieve its strategic objectives, in part because the Soviet regime managed to retain its cohesion and rally its people despite enormous territorial losses. Yet, had Hitler and the German High Command adopted a different approach, exploiting internal Soviet divisions more effectively, he might have triggered a civil war within the Soviet Union, potentially crippling Stalin's ability to mount a successful defense. The Soviet Union in 1941 was a vast, multi-ethnic empire rife with internal tensions. Decades of brutal Stalinist policies, including forced collectivization, purges, and repression, had alienated large segments of the population. Ethnic minorities, political dissidents, and even segments of the Red Army harbored deep resentment toward the Soviet leadership. The Great Purge between 1936 and 1938 had decimated the military officer corps and created widespread fear and distrust within the Soviet institutions. Many non-Russian ethnic groups, such as the Ukrainians, the Baltic peoples, Crimean Tatars, and Caucasian nations, had grievances against the Soviet rule. The Great Famine between 1932 and 1933, known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, had also left deep scars, making many Ukrainians view the German forces as potential liberators. Millions of political prisoners, former officers, and intellectuals languished in the Gulag system, and with proper coordination, these prisoners could have been mobilized against the Soviet regime. The Soviet soldiers who had survived Stalin's purges often had no love for the regime, but were simply forced to fight for it out of fear and execution or retaliation against their families. Love diving deeper into military history? This video is supported by my YouTube members who get exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else for their kind support. You can join their ranks easily. Just hit the join button now to get the exclusive videos and much more. Thank you for supporting me. I couldn't be doing it without your help. If you want to know more about Germany's Panzer tactics, check out my ebook in the description. A more calculated German approach to fomenting internal strife could have involved the following tactics. Instead of treating captured Soviet soldiers as subhuman and starving them to death in prisoner of war camps, Hitler and the German High Command could have capitalized on Soviet discontent by immediately recruiting Red Army defectors into anti-Stalinist military units. Instead of enforcing a brutal occupation policy, the Germans could have portrayed themselves as liberators from Stalinist oppression, promising autonomy and economic relief. If the Germans had treated occupied peoples better, they might have mobilized entire populations against the Soviet state. Various nationalist groups were already engaged in anti-Soviet resistance, and by arming and training these groups, the Germans could have opened multiple internal fronts against Stalin's government. The Germans could also have encouraged conspiracies within the Soviet officer corps, many of whom had been demoted, purged, or were fearful of Stalin's suspicion. If some key Soviet generals had defected or launched an internal coup, it could have paralyzed the Soviet response to the German invasion. It is a little known fact that in late 1941, the German losses were so high that despite his racial ideology, Hitler reluctantly agreed to allow the recruitment of Soviet citizens into German auxiliary forces. The Hilfswillige, or Hiwis, included former Red Army soldiers, local collaborators, and anti-communist volunteers who assisted the German army as logistical personnel, translators, and later even combat troops. As the war progressed, their number was so high that it was deemed necessary to identify these non-uniformed, non-German civilian personnel serving in the German army. As a result, identifying armbands were introduced from the 1st of October 1941 for non-German civilians serving in the German armed forces. This armband was roughly 40 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters tall, with a black printed script "Im Dienst der Deutschen Wehrmacht", or "in service of the German armed forces". The Hiwis comprised of 50% of the 2nd Panzer Army's 134th Infantry Division in late 1942, and the German 6th Army in the Battle of Stalingrad was composed of 25% of such personnel. By 1944, their numbers had grown to 600,000. Veteran Hiwis were particularly indistinguishable from regular German troops and often served in entire battalion strength. However, Hitler never fully trusted these forces and refused to organize them into a large-scale anti-Soviet army. The German High Command only permitted the creation of the Russian-led units later in the war, such as Andrei Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, which came too late to make a decisive impact. Had Hitler authorized the mass recruitment of Soviet defectors in 1941, he could have fielded hundreds of thousands of additional troops, possibly turning the tide in the Eastern Front. If the Nazis had successfully instigated a civilian war within the Soviet Union, the consequences could have been far-reaching. Stalin's ability to consolidate and redirect resources to the front lines would have been severely hampered by internal uprisings. The Soviet counteroffensive in late 1941, which halted the German advance on Moscow, might have been delayed or even prevented if significant internal divisions had emerged. While Stalin ultimately held the country together, a civil war on top of the German invasion might have led to regional breakaways, much like what happened during the earlier Russian Civil War between 1917 and 1922. While Operation Barbarossa failed due to Hitler's strategic miscalculations and logistical limitations, an alternative approach emphasizing internal destabilization of the Soviet Union might have dramatically changed the war's outcome. By effectively utilizing the Hilfswillige and exploiting nationalists and anti-Stalinist sentiments, the Nazis could have sown chaos behind Soviet lines, possibly leading to a civil war that would have significantly weakened or even destroyed the Soviet regime. However, Hitler's ideological rigidity and failure to recognize the potential of the anti-Soviet forces ultimately prevented such a scenario from unfolding. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support my channel, check out the PayPal donation link in the description or consider becoming a member. To make sure you don't miss my future work, subscribe to my channel please and press the bell notification button. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.